Hey guys, it's Kesara, and today we're going to be talking about the most disappointing books of 2020. So this is the first video in my 2020 reading recap. Check in the description for all of the videos that are going to be part of this recap. I'm really excited for this. I got a lot of great videos planned for you guys. Unlike last year where I split it up between like genres and did like top 10 or top few of each one, I'm just doing the top 10 in each of these categories. So most disappointing, most surprising, best, and worst. But I'm having two categories. I'm having fantasy and non-fantasy. So we're going to start this off with my non-fantasy ones, and this very first one is going to be the top 10 most disappointing non-fantasy books that I read in 2020. The first book that I want to talk about is Misery by Stephen King. So this book I don't think was that disappointing. It was only like mildly disappointing for me. I gave it like 3.75 stars, so within the 3-star range, but on Goodreads that would go into like the 4-star bucket because it's so close to a 4-star. This book I expected to absolutely love the way that I absolutely loved Pet Sematary and The Shining, because I feel like when people talk about like the best Stephen King books ever, these are the three that they talk about. They talk about The Shining, Pet Sematary, they talk about Misery, especially for like books on the shorter end for Stephen King as opposed to like The Stand and It, which are on his larger end. So I expected to really love this. I also really liked the premise of it. This is about a novelist who has this like really crazy fan that kidnaps him because he killed off like one of her favorite characters. I thought that would be just such a fun book to read, but it honestly wasn't fun at all for me. Like, I wanted more suspense from it, but it starts after he's already kidnapped, so there's not like a stalking factor in this at all. Like, he's already kidnapped. It's already happened, so it's more of just torture. And I didn't really enjoy that. Like, I think Stephen King books sometimes go a little bit over the line for me between like the suspense horror genre and the just straight up like, this is not enjoyable. And for me, this one wasn't. Like, it was still really good at points. Like, Stephen King has a way of putting this sort of aspect to a book where you kind of enjoy it in like a really dark way, but at the same time, there were definitely points where I was just like, this is just really depressing. I expected this book to be really dark. I wanted to like reading about the dark things, not get sad reading the dark things, if that makes sense. So that didn't really work for me. Not a bad book by any means, still an absolutely fantastic book, but just didn't work for me as well as I really wanted it to. So the next book that I want to talk about is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. I actually read this book in anticipation of the BookTube SFF Awards. I was really excited for it because I love time travel books. Anything to do with time, honestly, is really fascinating to me in fiction, but this is honestly not what I was expecting going into this book. I'm not saying it's bad. Like, I did think it was enjoyable, but it was just disappointing to me because it was really more of a romance than anything else. And I was definitely thinking like Doctor Who Time War sort of vibes from the title. And I went into it expecting a little bit more action, and it just honestly wasn't there. It was good for what it was. Like, I did enjoy it, but it was definitely not the type of book that I was looking for. And that really hindered my enjoyment of it overall, because while I did like the world building and kind of the idea of it, the story itself is already really short, so it didn't really go into a lot of the things that I would have wanted from this type of book. So the next book that I'd like to talk about on this list is Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward. So I've heard so many great things about this book, specifically that it's magical realism and that it's like really emotional and hard-hitting. And honestly, when I was reading it, it just was kind of boring to me. I love magical realism, but with my magical realism, I want the books to be beautiful. I want the writing to be beautiful. I want imagery to be beautiful. And I just didn't feel like I got that in this book. And then while there were some really emotional aspects to it, it just didn't hit me the way I wanted it to. So while I still think it's a good book and I would still recommend it to who like to read from like diverse perspectives and like contemporary or historical fiction, but overall it was not a favorite of mine. So while I really wanted to love it, I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. So the next book that I want to talk about is Only Human by Sylvain Neuval. So this is the third book in the Themis Files, which by the way, I absolutely love the Themis Files and I actually do still really like this book, but I feel like this was like a very big letdown after Waking Gods. I really loved Waking Gods, and there was a lot of things at the end of Waking Gods that made me so excited to read Only Human, and I feel like the book didn't really deliver on the things that I was looking for from the end of Waking Gods. In fact, it kind of almost like it delivered on the things that Waking Gods had already delivered on, so I didn't enjoy it as much. This one also feels a little bit more character driven, which surprised me because I didn't expect the series to be character driven at all, because if you've read the other two books in the series, the other two books, like, you almost don't really get to know the characters that well at all. You get to know them a little bit, but it's really a lot more about like the mystery, and there's some good bit of action and stuff like that that's really interesting. And while this one still has that, I feel like it's a little bit more about the characters and their relationships, and you get to know them a little bit more, which would have made me think that I would like this one more, but there's a lot that I feel like is left out. But I was expecting more world building from it that we didn't really. I mean, there's a little bit in there, but not as much as I really wanted. Like, this is a really short book for what I thought it was gonna be. And I definitely feel like there could have been a lot added to this book to make it like into a really fantastic book, but it just wasn't there. Good book overall, great series. I absolutely love Sleeping Giants and Waking Gods, but the finality was a bit of a disappointment. So the next book I want to talk about is The Little Prince by Anton Saint-Exupéry. I think that's how you pronounce his name. I'm not sure. So people talk about this book like it is the best book of all time, and I honestly don't get it. Like, I really don't. Maybe it's one of those books where you really need to have a physical copy of. I have heard that it's like one of those books that, like, when you read it as a kid and then read it again as an adult, you look at it completely differently, which I did not read it as a kid. So maybe that's why, but I honestly don't really remember what this book was about. Like, I don't remember very much about it at all, and I went into it with really high expectations because I feel like for a lot of people this book is like required reading. It's just so profound to them. So I went into it expecting to absolutely love it, and then I was just kind of like, well, this is kind of boring. Like, ugh. I hate to say that, but that's how I felt about it. Like, I honestly had very few feelings about this book either way, so it was just a big disappointment for me. So the next one I want to talk about is Regretting You by Colleen Hoover. I actually am kind of a fan of Colleen Hoover because I feel like the way she writes her books, even though sometimes I find the romances to be a little problematic, there are like a couple in general, sometimes I find the books to be really, really good. My favorite book by Colleen Hoover is definitely It Ends With Us, which was the first one that I read. And I think when you read like one of the author's best books as the first one that you read by them, it's kind of hard not to like that author. So even though I haven't liked any of her other books as much, I still like her as an author, and she writes mostly new adult romantic contemporaries. So Regretting You is one of those. It's following a mother and a daughter, and it kind of is following their relationship, but they're also both falling in love. For the most part, I really, really enjoyed this. There was just one part in particular that really made me disappointed in this book, because there's one scene in general that makes me feel really uncomfortable in the way that it was handled. It's never really addressed. It's definitely a scene that feels like there is a level of non-consent there, and it's kind of romanticized, and that scene made me feel really uncomfortable, which is like the first time that I felt that uncomfortable in one of Colleen Hoover's books. And I feel like there are other books by her that have way worse things that happen in them, but I think what annoyed me about this one is just it felt very out of character also. Like, it didn't feel like that character would be like that. It just made me really disappointed in the book overall. So next, I have to talk about The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. I had such high hopes for this book. So this book is a multiple worlds book. It's based off of the many worlds theory in physics, which basically hypothesizes that for every decision that you make, there's another world that exists in which you have made the opposite decision. So if you were trying to decide whether to go to college for engineering or art, and you decided to go to engineering, there's another world that exists in which you decided to go for your art degree instead, which, by the way, is one of my very favorite tropes in science fiction and fantasy. I absolutely love the many worlds trope. I'm so fascinated by the theory, and I'm always looking for more books like this. Problem is, I always want a little bit more science out of those books than I end up getting. And this one, it has a really cool twist on the many worlds trope, because you can't go to one of those other worlds if you have another self that exists in that world, or else you'll die. So they get some people from the not nicer side of town, let's put it that way, who are dead in a lot of the other worlds because they live in a dangerous area. And the main character here is dead in like 372 of those worlds. So she's very important because of that, because she can travel to many of those other worlds in which the characters on like the nicer side of town who have less risk for death are not in. So I love that aspect of it, and that conflict was actually done really, really well in this book. Just the culture there was done really well, and I like that class sort of distinction between the different types of characters. But everything else about this book was kind of meh for me. Like, there was a lot more that I felt like I could have done with like the sci-fi aspects of it, because it is going to multiple worlds. There's a lot that I feel like it could have done with the individual characters. I do think the plot was actually pretty good because it has like some good mysteries and stuff throughout, but I didn't like the way the plot twists were done that well. So while I did enjoy this book, it was a big disappointment because I wanted to just absolutely love it so much, because it's based off of like one of my favorite tropes of all time, and it just didn't quite do it for me. So the next book that I want to talk about is definitely an unpopular unpopular opinion. Like, it is 100% an unpopular opinion. And that's Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I understand why people love this book. I absolutely understand it so much because I wanted to love this book so much. There were so many aspects of this book that I absolutely loved. I don't even want to say because spoilers, but there are just so many great twists and turns that I was not expecting. Like, there's a big twist in the middle that was just so well done. I loved it so much, but the romance, I could not get behind the romance at all. Like, I could not do it. I just, it just made me so uncomfortable. I can't even with this romance. Like, I hated the romance so much. I didn't want it to be real. I wanted at some point for the author to come out and just go, she's not gonna end up with him or something like that. Apparently she really did love him. That is what happened, and I could not with this book because of that. It just was so disappointing because, I mean, with the romance, like, Jane Eyre is a governess and she falls in love with her employer, Mr. Rochester. So she falls in love with her boss. He's in a position of power above her. It really felt to me like he was taking advantage of her. Like, 100% the entire time, it felt like he was taking advantage of her. So it just made me icky the entire time that I was reading the romance here. And I feel like it's a product out of its time because I can see why during that time period, that's not how it would have felt because there's a class difference there. And why would he want to seduce a girl of a lower class than him or whatever? But, it just made me feel icky the entire time, which is so disappointing because every other aspect of this book, I loved so much. Like, I loved it so much. And I can see if you can root for that romance somehow, I can totally understand why this would be your favorite book of all time. But the romance just completely ruined the book for me. Just like completely ruined it because I could not picture them together. I could not see the two main characters together, and icky. That's my word for this book. And that's not what it's supposed to be. That's not how I'm supposed to feel in this book. I'm supposed to root for it, and it just didn't work for me. Definitely a huge disappointment. And now for the most disappointing book of 2020 for me, it has to be A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor by Hank Green. So this book is a sequel to An Absolutely Remarkable Thing, which last year, An Absolutely Remarkable Thing made my 2019 most surprising books of the year. I read it towards the end of last year, picked it up on a complete whim, and oh my gosh, I loved it so much. So of course, when A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor was announced, I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I want to see what happens next. I love these characters and I can't wait to see more of them and to see more of like their thought processes and stuff like that. But I feel like everything that made An Absolutely Remarkable Thing so great just was not in the sequel book. So even though I still enjoyed it and I still think it was a good book, it just wasn't outstanding the way the first book was. I was just expecting so much from this book, and I didn't end up getting it. So it was definitely the biggest disappointment for me this year because I really wanted it to be a 5-star book and a new favorite of mine, but I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. So that's all I have for you guys. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these because I'd love to discuss with you guys. I post videos on Sundays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, so consider subscribing. And if you'd like to be notified as soon as I upload, you can click that little bell icon. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up to support my channel. All social media links are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.